Well, there are many. It's not obviously virtuosic. It's not like there are so many notes that it's tricky as in a Beethoven sonata or Brahms. Um, but it's very subtle throughout. The changes that you need to make in terms of the sound, and I think one of the biggest things is, of course, this piano is a world away from the piano that Schubert wrote for and used. So there are problems of balance, and there are also problems of articulation and weight. Most of this sonata is quite light and sort of leggero and dancing, and all these things are completely achievable on a Steinway, but you have to think a little bit harder about how to achieve these things. On a forte piano, a lot of the articulations and the dynamics just make perfect sense straight away. Whereas on the Steinway or a Yamaha or a Bosendorf or whatever modern piano, you need to work quite hard to get to that place where you're doing something, I think, appropriate to the music. I think, also Schubert's notation needs a lot of thought. It's not like when you're playing Beethoven, where if you really stick to his articulation and particularly his dynamics, the music just works. I think Schubert was much more extreme in a way. So he uses a lot of very quiet dynamics sometimes, piano, pianissimo, pianissimo, and you can end up going into a bit of a hole if you're not too careful trying to play too quietly. He also uses a lot of accents, and there needs to be an enormous amount of variety in how you play those accents. I'm not sure if I can find a good example of that. Is that useful? I can't find a good example of that, basically. Oh yeah, something like this phrase. The upbeat has an accent, and then the downbeat has an accent as well. So how you play that, and also is quite a different touch, although the sign is the same. So you can't be literal. It's not just a case of looking at the page, oh, this means that, I just play it like that. Every phrase requires a different kind of thought. There's also the issue of finding a place where the articulation of the piano and the violin meet, because the onset of the note is so different with the violin, and their approach to play staccato and portato particularly is very different. You really have to find a way of creating a kind of similarity in the articulation that sounds convincing, otherwise you can sound like you're playing two completely different pieces.
The first problem you have is the very opening, because the piano is a percussion instrument. So you have to, he's written something which is extraordinary sound at the bottom of the piano, but it's like somebody coming out of the ground. And then when the violin comes in, you have to find a way of singing and of dancing. I think that's the most important thing to realise with this piece, that it's all about the Viennese tradition of dancing. Normally it's a waltz, Viennese waltz, but here it's a dance in two. So you have to find a way of lifting off, and dancing is about taking steps and going up and down, not flat. So you have to learn to lift, and all the time he's writing little accents which tells you that you have to go up, up. But it's finding the combination with the violin of singing and getting the articulation to make the phrases bounce, and for the piano to get either at the beginning the right hand to sustain the left hand, to make the two instruments make a blend. So all the time you're struggling to find the way of making Schubert dance, and that's what I think this movement is about. You have it all the time. A dance, three different types of dance, At the end, you have to get the lift off, and that's the real problem. Now, one of the interesting things about Schubert is that he doesn't just give you a piano accompaniment to a tune, but he gives you a piano accompaniment that has its own identity. So it's not just geared towards the tune or the dance, but it has something else that it gives, and that's difficult for the ensemble. You have to be able to be flexible. And when you have the dance later on in canon, with the accompaniment has to be able to give to the tune all the time. So you never play 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, or 1, 2. It's always dancing. So there's a little bit of rubato, and that's when you have to be on the same wavelength, and you have to give and take all the time. So the yum bum bum is not da ba 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 ba, but yum ba ba da ba ba, going up. Everything's going up. In fact, that's the secret of the movement, is to make everything go up. And not that. And dance. Well, it's very interesting that with Mozart, if you don't go to an opera by Mozart, then you cannot play his instrumental music. You have to understand that Mozart's music is all about singing the melodies, and what he does is most of his phrases are divided into 2 or 4 or 8 bars, which means you have to learn to balance them up, otherwise they just sound like 2 bars, 2 bars, 2 bars, 2 bars. And what you're doing is you're making the characters of the music as a singer that has much, in an opera, it becomes a person. So you have to become this person of the voice. In Schubert, he was the greatest songwriter, so you have to learn to sing, but within much less time. And I would say that really you have to sense the colours of Schubert. There are many more colours. He writes pianissimo and fortissimo much more than Mozart ever did. So he really wants music that it's almost like before French Impressionist sound, so that you're really, really floating with it. So they are his songs. He never really wrote a particularly great opera, but because he concentrated the character into the songs in such a way that you could feel the character straight away. Like in the instrumental music, you can feel each of the different characters in the movements.
That's it, thank you.
It's quite hard to say. I suppose Schumann's piano writing is, on the page, quite simple. He doesn't use many different textures, not in the same way that Beethoven does. He tends to sort of stick to one texture, and the textures that he uses are simpler. Scales, arpeggios, chords. It's not kind of sophisticated in the same way that Chopin is, or Liszt later on. So you have to find a lot of nuance from these very simple accompaniment figures. You know, even at the beginning, the accompaniment for the left-hand melody is just. To get that feeling portato, on offbeat, and having a little bit of shape and so on, I find that a lot more difficult than playing, say, some Brahms, where you've got a lot more to do, and I suppose you've got fewer options as well in terms of how you interpret it. I think, yeah, I mean, also, you know, Schubert's a very early Romantic composer, and he does rely on legato for the melodies a lot, but the textures are often quite light and dance-like, and I think it needs this feeling of sort of being on its toes at all times. which you don't always hear. I think because people see him as a romantic composer, he gets played in a purely romantic middle 19th century legato kind of way, and I'm not sure that's always the best approach. Certainly in a piece like this, which is more springy. Well, I mean, it's difficult. There's a lot of overlap, of course. Um, in often, certainly in this piece, you're not carrying the melody, so you can concentrate much more on the nuance of the accompaniment and the character that it provides, and the balance of the texture. In a way, I suppose that feels a little bit less pressured because you're sharing the musical ideas. You carry the melody between each other, and the piano does have the melody quite a lot, but it is really the violin that's the melodic instrument through this work, at any rate. I mean, in Schubert's works for piano and another instrument as a whole, I mean, two of them certainly are probably the most virtuosic things that he wrote, and I think probably harder than in terms of actually playing the actual notes than any of the piano solo repertoire. The variations for the flute and piano Trottenblimmen and the violin fantasy. On the other hand, I don't think, apart from that violin fantasy, the sort of the intensity that you find in some of the late Schubert sonatas isn't quite there in the same way. There's a little bit more joy, a little bit more light, a little bit more dancing. The intensity of really the last 5 sonatas for solo piano is something all to their own. I think they're quite a special thing, and the works for piano and another instrument don't quite reach that place.